Thank you, Mayor. Doug Bach, County Administrator. So for tonight's presentation, we're going to walk through a few different areas from a budget workshop perspective. One, our revenue estimates, which is important for all of you to take in to understand just where we are as we concluded last year. And then as we're able to move through getting about 6 full months into this year, it certainly puts us in a better position when we start to project where we're at for the coming year. We also wanted to walk through where we are with the American Rescue Plan and the dollars that are coming in from that perspective. I know we've reviewed this some with you, but this will allow us to go into a little bit more detail of where we're at and some of the things we're looking at for this. And also then I wanted to talk about employee recruitment, hiring, and retention, which is really a very big cost center for us. It's also becoming a very big issue for us as we are trying to keep people into our organization and hire them into our organization. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our Chief Financial Officer, Kathleen Von Atchen, and let her make presentation on the revenue estimates. Kathleen.
So yes, we're going to start off with the revenue estimate. And so typically we start off the budget process by looking at how much money is coming in. And so our budget process typically begins at this point, except it's been delayed somewhat by a new state law. So we're now examining an amendment to our current year 2021 budget and working towards development of our 2022 budget. So next slide. Before we start off, I thought we should look at, just getting to know our revenue base and what supports our services. These are total revenues across all the unified government, excluding one-time revenues and other financing sources. And you can see since 2017 to 2020, there has been some revenue growth, but you can really see that it's varied quite a bit. In the first year in 2017, it went up 5.2%. Then it dropped by, then it only grew by 1.3%. In 2019, we had a good year, and that grew by 3.1%. But then with COVID, our total revenues actually declined by 2.9%. So we're ending the fiscal 2022 with revenues roughly in the range of $318 million in total. And over there on the side in the box there, you can see generally what contributed to some of the revenue growth and decline. We did get that big star bond increase. And so that contributed to the $15.5 million increase in 2017. But then in 18 and 19, the growth was at $4.1 and $9.6 million each year, even despite the fact that we had a $2 million reduction in those years. So, and then in 2020, across all the revenue base without any one-time revenues, we saw a decline in revenues of $9.4 million. That's during our COVID. Next slide. So just going to recap on some of our major revenues, property tax trends. As you can see, since 2007, when the Great Recession happened, there was a decline in property tax revenues during that time. But then since then, it's been growing steadily, reaching $97 million in 2020. So between 2017 and 2019, Kansas City, Kansas mill rate was reduced by 6 mills during that time period. And the UG is relying on property tax revenue for supporting our operations. Now, not so much in the city general fund, but, you switched. Not so much in the city general fund, where only 17% are relying on property tax, but very much so on the county side, where 62% of our operations is supported by property tax. So, this growth is needed to cover public safety employee costs and to support needed cash-funded capital projects and equipment acquisitions that to replace aging equipment. And so all of that to deliver quality services to our residents. Next slide. The next largest is sales tax, and that has trended upwards mainly because of the STAR bond payoff that occurred in 2017. But that STAR bond payoff and the fact that we reduced our mills during 17 through 19 increased our reliance on sales tax as opposed to property tax. And so generally sales tax, so since the STAR bond collection in January 2017, sales tax receipts have been relatively flat. And that unfortunately, they've ranged about $4 to $5 million each month. And, they did drop during COVID in 2020, they dropped by 1.85%. They didn't drop as much as I anticipated, so we're very fortunate for that. But, and they have rebounded afterwards. The next slide is use tax. So we don't often talk about use tax, but it's now becoming a more prevalent revenue source, and it's derived from the equipment acquisition of new company startups and as well as online sales. So use tax receipts have grown from 7 million in 2007 up to 13 million in 2020. And the COVID-19 did not greatly impact this revenue as you would think it would have, because overall the total only increased by 1.6% in 2020. And part of that is because of the composition of that sales or that use tax, where the amount we get from company equipment acquisitions and startups varies greatly depending on what companies are doing, and so that causes that total to change quite a bit. In 2020, we saw a 55% increase in online sales, and that which contributed to an additional $3 million in use tax collections. And you can see in 2020 how the light green amount was greater in 19 than in 20, and that's the amount that we got from other types of uses. And the dark green in the graph there is the amount from online sales. So it's really picking up online sales and use tax collections. The largest in the retail sector for online sales is Amazon, and as you probably would have guessed. So the next slide is another large revenue source for us, and that's the payment in lieu of taxes that we collect from the Board of Public Utilities. And that amount is not only a franchise tax, but it's also a payment in lieu of property tax. It's calculated by 11.9% of the gross revenues of the electric and water utility. And the unified government sewer and stormwater utilities also pay the same, or a pilot as well, just so you all know. And so the total 2020 pilot equaled $32 million, or almost $33 million. That is down 4.2% from what the amount we collected in 19. And with the split being 27 million from electric and 5 million from water. So the BPU did experience a $7.5 million drop in electric consumption during 2020 due to large industries and businesses being forced to close during COVID, and that consumption declined. And major industries, some of them are not expected to come back onto operations until the end of 2021. So that revenue source is going to continue to struggle. The next slide. So the next two slides talk about our estimates for the upcoming budget. So we're going to amend the current year budget because the revenue estimates that we currently have in the budget for the current year were done last summer when there were a lot of unknowns. And so we're going to change those numbers, and then we're going to estimate what we think is going to happen in the next 18 months, right? So I've included a little bit more information on to give you some context for 2020 here. So sales tax, although it did decline 1.85% last year during COVID, we are expecting a rebound, basically a catch up for the 2-year period with 9.8% growth based on year-to-date trends. Because we're doing revenue estimates a little later in the budget process, we have more data. And those restoring the receipts, basically this increase is, if you compare it against 2019, is a 7.8% increase. And then for 2020, we're going to use 2.2% growth rate, just based on prior year growth rates, a conservative growth rate. The use tax, which is another component of sales tax, and as I mentioned before, it grew by 1.6% in 2020. We're expecting it to grow by 16.8% in 2021, based on year-to-date trends. And basically, the receipts have really picked up in the first quarter of the first half of 2021. And then in 2022, we're expecting it to grow by 3%, based on prior year growth rates. Property tax in 2020, that revenue grew by 4.3%, and that was based on an assessed value for Kansas City, Kansas of 4.9% and a delinquency rate factor of 7.2%. So the 7.2% delinquency factor, although it's not as great as I budgeted or expected, when we were in the middle of COVID, it is greater than the amounts that delinquency rate that we had in the prior years. So in the prior years, it was around 5.7%. So it has picked up. It increased to 7.2%. And I believe that in 2021, or actually, we've almost collected all the revenue from property tax. So the current delinquency rate in 2021 is at 7.4% right now. And the growth, it happens to coincide the same with the growth in the actual revenue source, based on a 5.4% increase in assessed value. Now, the appraiser and our UG clerk have already certified the property tax assessment value, and they've come in at a 3.5% increase for assessed value in Kansas City, Kansas. And I'm anticipating that the delinquency rate will drop to 6.6%. So that results in an increase in property tax of only 2.4% overall. Excuse me. Go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Go back one. So the 2022, why would we only anticipate a 2.4% growth? And you're talking about assessed value of all property, commercial and residential, correct?
Yeah.
And do we know why? Because clearly the trend is higher and higher, 4.9, then 5.4. I don't understand why. How did we come to a 3.5%?
Well, so this is okay. So I'll tell you why. So this is this property tax includes all the property tax, including the county, right? So I just, for simplicity, I put just the Kansas City, Kansas figures. So the Wyandotte County assessed value figures and delinquency factor are slightly different. So that kind of the melding of the two combined calculations resulted in that 2.4%.
I guess what I'm questioning is if the average increase in value in 2020 was 4.9 and then 2021 was 5.4, why would we anticipate even slower growth? Because from how I understand where the markets are, there's a demand for housing, especially affordable housing, and we have a lot of that still. And so that's being bid up. So 3.5 seems low to me, but.
Okay. Well, So I meant to mention that in the back of your packet, there's some additional information, like 25 or more slides that talk a lot about the different components of each of these major revenues. And so one of the packets in your slides, which I can refer you to, is how the property tax assessed value or the assessed value, what components it contains. So it is, basically half and half residential and commercial. And commercial property, sadly, residential property has been increasing at a good clip in the 7 to 8% range, or we're even 9 over the past few years. But commercial property has really dropped quite a bit. And so this past year, it dropped significantly. In fact, it only increased by 0.4%.
I got it.
There's also the state assessed utilities, the railroads and the utilities that are assessed by the state, and those really declined as well this past year. And then personal property every year declines because of a statute that was changed back over 10 years ago on how they handle machinery and equipment. So unfortunately, that combination of half of our assessed value actually declining really drew down the assessed value in total for the county and the city.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And then the other point is that we are the 2022 will be our third out of 4 years in which we are refunding Hollywood Casino for property tax they paid in protest previously, which we lost that lawsuit. And so that has a $1 million impact on the amount we collect. So, but I recommend that you go through those slides and take a look, and I'm happy to answer any question. Okay, the next slide. Good. So the second slide here has to continues to talk about revenue estimate assumptions. So fees, permits, fines, all across the UG declined by 12% in 2020. And in 21, based on year-to-date growth, it looks like we're going to pick up back where we were in 19 with a 13% growth rate. That doesn't mean that it's going to, create a whole bunch of new revenue. It's basically the same as what we collected 2 years ago. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these growth rates. In 2022, 3.2% growth rate, based on modest increases in various services that are tied to that have CPI factors in their contracts, such as sewer, garbage, and other areas. The BPU pilot, as I mentioned before, the consumption level in the electrical, utility is struggling as industries are slow to coming back online. So in 2020, we saw a 4.2% decline over 2019 due to lower kilowatt hour consumption and water consumption due to all the closures. And in 2021, based on year-to-date trends, we see that it won't be as bad, but it's going to continue to decline by 1.3%. And then in 2022, we think things are going to resume and that certain industries will be coming online in the tail end of 2020, resulting in for 2022, a 3.5% increase. And then lastly, transient guest tax is not a big number, but it was tremendously affected by COVID. It declined by 33% due to less tourism activity in 2020. We see it coming back to 26% in 2021. And then another 24% growth rate based on as tourism resumes, and also anticipating new hotel days. Next slide. So this graph shows the major revenue sources, and what I've provided you is some information so you can get a little context of the years. So in the green is 2019. We skipped 2020 because we all know that was low. And So we're just looking at 2021 original with the yellow, 21 revised, which is what I've been talking about for in the light orange, and then the darker orange is our estimate for 2022. And so overall, I just want to point out, I don't think I need to go over each of these, but you can see how some of these revenue sources are actually were affected differently by the COVID. And although we are improving and picking back up to where we were before, we are not quite where we should be. If you factor in the fact that had there not been any COVID, these increases between the 2 years would have been greater than what you're seeing. Overall, for all of these 4 revenues comprise of 85% of the total 2022 general fund revenues, and which are totaling $222 million. And the revenue estimates in total demonstrate that we only have $5 million in new money for 2022 to reallocate for growing needs in our operations or new initiatives. So
Catherine, just to be clear, is it only, okay, $5 million in additional revenue? Go back one slide. But it's only this only represents 85% of the total. There's no net revenue growth in the other 15%.
No. This is just to point out that graphically, I'm only showing you 85% of the
And that
revenue.
85%,
But
5%, $5 million.
yes, the total only represents $5 million more in additional revenue. Yeah. And that's just a consolidated city, county, parks, general fund.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Why are you just showing us 85%?
Well, just because it would be too busy if we showed all the revenues here. I could, we could show you all the other revenues.
I think I would have liked to have seen the 2020 in relationship to the prior year and the current year, just to see the just to see how it's been affected. That's
Yeah.
just a comment that I have. I would love to see a bar for 2020 on all those, but.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to provide that. It's really easy. So we can send that back out to all of you, along with the other 15% in revenues too. So this is a preliminary outlook of the consolidated general fund. We provided a couple of years as context. So in 19, we had total revenues of $213 million with expenditures of $210 million. So that was a net margin between revenues and expenditures of a positive $4.2 million in 2019. So that gave us an ending fund balance back then of $42.3 million. And this is based on the comprehensive annual financial report figures. That represents 20% of our expenditures and transfers, which is greater than the 2-month minimum target reserve. A minimum target reserve is roughly 16.7% of expenditures and transfers. So, that was good. Now we've provided 2020 original budget, just to give some context of the difference in how much money we collected, sort of as a baseline of what we would have collected had there not been COVID, and then how much we did collect. So we don't have too many columns. So we just used the original budget and then actuals to show that difference. And so in 2020, even though we budgeted at the beginning of the year, not knowing about COVID, $219.6 million, we ended up collecting $208 million. So there's that, reduction in revenue that we experienced during COVID. On the expenditure side, we originally budgeted $223 million, but we ended up only spending $205 million. Now, much of that, as you can see in the capital outlay line, was due to reductions in cash capital and equipment acquisitions. We reduced them, but certainly, much of that has to be done later. It's not going away. So if equipment needs to be replaced, it has to be replaced in the subsequent years. And then the big difference in expenditures, certainly the departments really did step up and make changes to their operations and cut costs. And we did hold off on hiring positions. But it's also due to reimbursement of public safety expenditures coming from the CARES Act, which were recorded as a net negative against the expenditure line in 193. So that you'll see that a little bit too. So as a result, rather than ending the year with a deficit net margin, we ended the year with $3.3 million in the positive. And you're going to see that later in the comprehensive annual financial report that you'll see at the regular meeting later on. So we ended the year with 22.3% of expenditures and transfers, which is far exceeds it exceeds the 16.7% 2-month operating target that we had. So in 2021 original budget was put together after we knew a little bit more about COVID, but still weren't sure about what was happening with the fall wave and perhaps, when the vaccine was going to come out. And, all of that was still an unknown when we did the budget last summer. And so we estimated that our revenues were going to come in at $215 million. And we're now saying they're coming in at $222 million. So that's $7 million greater. On the expenditure side, we budgeted $214 million on the top end there. And we're anticipating, $215 million. So we're anticipating an increase of $1 million in that expenditure line. And that basically accounts for a number of contract changes that have been adopted since during that time. So over the past 6 months. We have made some slight changes in capital outlay that we showed you during the CMIP process, and transfers out we're recommending some transfers out because of some obligations that we chose not to do because of COVID, and now because we see that there's a little bit more money, there's more money available to pay back some of the obligations that we had. So, the good news is the net is that between revenues and expenditures for the current year, we see only a $500,000 net difference. So between revenues and expenditures. So we expect to end the year with a percentage of expenditures and transfers of about 20%. So now we're not showing you the 2022 year yet because that's part of the budget process. We still need to go through and examine our expenditure levels and work through our process with our departments and the county administrator's administration. So any questions on this?
Yep, thank you.
So as I see in the big picture here, we're expecting about $7 million more in revenue in 2021. And most of that, 5 million of it, we're just going to put in the bank and increase our fund balance. Would that be correct?
No, we're not adding any in 2021 to the fund.
So I see, help me with this, $7 million in revenue, $2 million in additional expenditures.
Yeah, so when we did the original budget, we anticipated using our reserves at the $5.2 million
I
level.
see.
Yeah.
So we're only expecting to increase our expenditures by $2 million.
Yes, that's right.
All right, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, again, I think please use the raise your hand because I can check it on this. I may not see you otherwise. Thank you. Commissioner Kane.
Okay, Mayor, this new computer, bear with me. What is the actual amount of monies that we lost last year through the pandemic?
Well, so we've been talking about how much revenue we lost because of the pandemic, and so in the future, well, actually in the next presentation, I'm going to talk about the revenue loss, right? And that revenue loss figure is calculated based on the Treasury guidance, and it only includes certain revenues and not others. This is the total big picture for the general fund. And so you see the total picture and you can see the difference right here. Yeah.
Somebody just in a little plain card. I want to know what we thought we were going to do, what we did, and where we're at for 20. And I want the exact same thing for 21.
Yeah.
Your
Okay.
numbers are confusing me. And like
What-
what Jim's saying, it looks like we got more money than we ever thought we were going to have. And then exactly how much stimulus money we got last year, how much stimulus money we think we're going to get this year. I
Yeah.
don't like this chart.
So this is
I'm not
just
done.
the general
I'm not
fund?
done.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So all it is a little bit, I'm not asking for a great big long chart. I'm asking for something super simple. The KISS theory, keep it simple, stupid. Because if you want to confuse somebody, go ahead and read that chart. So I'm asking for that, and I hope we get it before the 7 o'clock meeting. I hope I get it before 7 o'clock meeting.
And so if you look at the top line up there where you see the total revenue and transfers,
Yep.
and where we see 2020 original budget, 219.6 million. And then the next line, 2020 actual, 208.9. So this is an isolated picture of the consolidated general funds. We got 11 million less in these funds than what we originally projected in 2020.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, now, what Kathleen was saying is she's going to show you in the next part of the presentation, there's a bigger number that comes together because we look at all different areas and different formulas. But if we just look at these funds, which are our taxing ones, that we were down $11 million last year.
Okay.
Yep.
One more time.
Yeah.
I want it simple. I want it where I can read it with, I don't care, add all the numbers you got. But I want to be able to say to Joe Citizen, here's what it is. And if I sent this to Joe Citizen right now, he'd be going, what the hell does that mean? So
I think we'll be able to provide that to you
I want it separate.
that way.
I mean, I don't care if you show it up here or not, but I want one specifically like I asked.
Next slide. Any more questions on this?
Yep.
Oh, good.
Why is this not showing up here?
Put it back, put it back.
Why is this? Go ahead.
Well, so just to help my confusion,
Oh,
$5 million that we're going to put in the bank is the difference between $40 million that we thought we were going to put in the fund balance and $45 million that we're now. We are making a conscious decision to increase our fund balance by $5 million.
Jim, I'm following the same thing you're following.
I'm looking at
Yeah, the 5.2 and the 0.4.
40.4 ending fund balance in the 2021 original budget. And the 2021 revised estimate is 45.
Well, so the reason so yes, but we ended the prior year with $45 million, right? That was based on a lower revenue estimate. So in 2021, right? Because we're not taking in all the revenue we need to have a balanced budget, we're using in the original budget $5 million. And actually the fund balance goes down. So the decision when we did the original budget was actually to use $5 million of reserves Now, in the revised, we're not using the 5 million in reserves because the revenue number went up.
Right. We are making a decision. Using that 5 million was okay when we approved the original 2021 budget. Now we're changing our approach, deciding to put $5 million more in bank.
Yes, so some of the budget amendments that you're finding in the revised estimate for expenditures and capital, some of those decisions were made when the labor contracts were approved. Not all of them, but as part of the upcoming budget process, we will be reviewing with you all of the department requests. So it's not a done deal. And it's just an estimate, as I have in that column.
Commissioner, I'll probably, a decision based on an estimate. There's no decision until we do a budget and go through and adopt it. This is how the numbers add up today. So if you want to call that a decision, because we're just showing you how the math works, because the bottom line is, as you're saying, we were calculating we were going to have 45 million in fund balance, or we're 45 million beginning fund balance, and then we'd end at 44. Because the math worked that way, we redid our 2021 estimates. I could have a 2022 estimated up here budget too. It doesn't mean we made a decision on it. Those are just early projections. So
Yeah.
taking 2021, because we've adopted, we know some certain expenses are already going to be here, that are some changes, what we know is the new revenues. That's how the math works out. And it does move that 5 million like that, like you're saying, if we let it end up like this.
Thank you. Why is it not showing? Rocky?
You have Commissioner Johnson.
Okay.
Go ahead. Who had first, Commissioner Johnson, or
Okay, thank you.
why is this not doing this?
Yeah, I did not look at this in terms of any conscious decision. But what I will say is that
That's just,
it appears to me, Kathleen, that we did better than what we anticipated by these numbers.
Yes.
And for that, I do want to appreciate you and Doug. And I want the commission to understand also, a lot of this is coming from our directive as well. I don't look at that as a conscious decision. I look at that as that's what happened. And so the question I have, I think, is more along the lines of Commissioner Burrows when he asked the question, how those federal funds or those CARE funds or those other funds that came in during 2020 and maybe 2021 affect the overall numbers.
Right. Okay. Well, so the CARES Act money was deposited into the grant fund, which is not showing here.
So it's
right?
not on there.
Right. But some of those funds were deemed as public safety reimbursements. And so when those funds,
Weird.
when that money came into
Okay,
the
let
general
me just
fund, it
go-
reduced the expenditure line because we were reimbursing public safety costs. Now, off the top of my head, I can't
Oh,
remember
that's
how
not
much
good.
that was. So we'd be
Okay.
happy to bring back how much that was and what the impact of all the CARES Act dollars were.
Yeah, I think it
On
would be
this,
important for us to know
Well, that's why.
Yeah.
the impact of the CARES Act, however it was plays out on the revenues or on the expenditures
Yes.
as
but
relates to.
Not in the
reimbursement.
revenue line at all.
Right.
It's all in
But it's just in
expenditure.
expenditures. It would be interesting to know how that affected the overall bottom line. I think we're moving in the right direction. I think also that we are not out of the storm. I think our buddy, the Wizard of Omaha, or the Oracle of Omaha, said that everything is still kind of uneven. And so we don't know where we're going to be yet in terms of trends. And so I think we're not out of the woods yet, but I appreciate,
That's why.
and I want to say that publicly, the directive that we're giving to you as well as Doug
Go up here.
and your staff and how it's playing out. So, thank you.
Commissioner Burrows.
I think Kane is there.
Commissioner Kane, go ahead.
Oh,
I'm gonna, comment was said about the unions getting raises, and the goal is to always give our
Yeah.
employees raises.
I don't, yeah,
But I
there-
believe there are several people on staff that got a major amount of raises. So we should never just point out that one class got raises and others didn't. When the class I'm talking about, some of them got up to 20 some odd $1,000 in raises. That affects the budget as well. So, and I'm a firm believer that every single person should always get the exact same thing, that we shouldn't feed the top and not feed the bottom.
Commissioner Burrows?
Thank you, Mayor. Kathleen, if I understand with some of the questions that are being asked, we were, 2020 budget, we were going to use $5 million of reserves.
Right.
Now we're not utilizing those reserves, so that's the $5 million that you show. So we're actually at a push. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's the simple language that
Yeah.
we're not using the 5 million. We've got 5 million more, so we're back to our bottom line that we wanted. So we're at a push. We didn't get as hurt as bad as we thought we would, and we didn't have to hit our reserves. The second question I have is in reference to the CARES Act money. We have, within the CARES Act money, there were administration costs that we were able to attach to utilization of the CARES Act money. And I think in some of that breakdown, those administration costs could have gone to us collectively as a unified government for staff to do the work, or it could have been utilized to outsource for an audit to ensure that we're in compliance with what the Federal Reserve and or the treasurers are asking us to do with those dollars. I think it would be prudent for us to break down those expenses if we took an administration fee of 5%, how much money that might have been and how that came into play within the budget, as well as any other dollars that were utilized to supplant budget expenses so that we as a commission have a more thorough, transparent understanding of how those dollars were spent. I think maybe that's what I hope to be able to get to. And it can be very simple and very cursory report just to ensure that if we were able to bring in $1.2 million for administration, how much of that $1.2 million of administration was actually spent. It was charged to the CARES fund, but did we spend it? Did we save some of it? And is it part of that $5 million? I think that's what I'm looking at to see if those dollars were spent prudently and not just banked for a later day expense.
So I'm happy to provide you that report, and I'm also happy to maybe give you a little synopsis to respond to that question. So, you know, we collected around 37 million in CARES Act dollars. We formed an internal team including Crystal and a variety of internal staff, and we diverted their salary while they were working on that CARES Act team from the general fund and other places within the UG operations to the CARES Act fund, grant fund, to pay for those costs. I don't remember offhand how much that is, but it comprised 5 or 6 or 7 people for about 6 or 8 months. And then in terms of the accounting, the audit function, we have an external auditor that comes and audits our books. She's been working with my accounting manager for the past 4 or 5 months on the comprehensive annual financial report. And her team and her firm will also be examining the CARES Act in the coming months when the single audit is due out in another 3 months. So, and you know, offhand, I don't remember if there is an additional cost related to her audit work of the CARES Act. So I just need to double check, but it would be pretty minimal. So, you know, we tried to minimize the administrative costs related to administering the CARES Act dollars. It took a lot of effort to get it all the money spent and expedited according to deadlines, but we used internal staff as much as we could. And I think Alan House may be able to add some more information on that.
I think you're right. And we can get the exact numbers for you. I think it was in the $500,000 plus kind of range for that administrative cost. It was well below the sort of max threshold set within the CARES Act for administrative costs.
And basically what I'm looking at is cost avoidance, because that's basically what we did. We didn't have to absorb the cost in our budget. We absorbed the cost through the CARES Act dollars.
Right.
And it would be prudent for us to know was it effective enough that we have learned something from it? And it was talked about raises. Were raises included from that CARES Act administration dollars that went out? I don't know. And in all full transparency, it's really not what I'm looking for. I'm just wanting to ensure that we were prudent and we were under a very narrow, aggressive timeline to get those monies out. So I do know that we should at least ensure that what we did was correct and what we have an opportunity to learn from that going into next year when we get the ARA money, that ARP money that's coming in.
Yeah, we we learned a great deal from administering the CARES Act. And in fact, one of the things that I learned is that we need to spend more focused time standing up a grant management team, including writing a grants manager manual and a grants policy. So those are things that we plan to do in the coming months.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Commissioner Bynum.
The other piece of that is that we at Administration and Human Services Standing Committee that Commissioner Merkley chairs, we were having almost monthly updates on that. And so what you're asking for, Commissioner, I think could probably be pulled from some of what was presented at some of those meetings last fall, when we, as that committee, were receiving pretty regular updates on that whole process. And I do think that the 37 million CARES Act experience was just a warm-up show based on, you know, what we're going to be dealing with now. So it was a good experience and we probably did learn a lot, but I think some of what Commissioner Burrows is asking for is pretty readily available.
Kathleen, wow. I'm not going to talk until I get this.
Well, along those lines, you know, you give me a great idea, which is, I think it'd be really helpful if we had kind of a closeout CARES Act report that we can put together and provide all that information and then put it up on our website. So, yeah. So should we go to the next slide? Okay. So this is the last revenue slide. Just because we often overlook some of the special revenue funds. So in general, you know, some of the key ones are dedicated sales tax, which is, of course, all sales tax. It's derived from 3/8 cent sales tax dedicated for public infrastructure in our neighborhoods, as well as police and fire personnel. And, you know, it suffered during the 2020. And so we, but in 2020, we're expecting in 2022 for it to rebound pretty nicely. And part of the drag on that is that it has, well, the Legend Star Bond money in the general fund is capped, right? So any growth goes to pay off the bond. So it kind of drags down the total in the general fund. But here it's not capped. So any growth in the Legends is reflected in these funds. So, and then the Street and Highway Fund, you know, those were really estimated to be pretty low because gas prices dropped during the COVID. And but they seem to be rebounding now. So tourism promotion seems to be rebounding too, as I mentioned earlier with my estimates. The sewer fund is, you see here, is just a reflection of the 5% growth rate in the charges for services, which is part of that, the settlement agreement.
I don't know.
And then EMS, again, is one that's really dependent on two things, but mainly sales tax. They have a 25 cent sales tax. And so it's impacted as well. But like the dedicated sales tax fund, it captures all the growth in the Legends. It's not kept by the bonds. So that's all I got for revenues. And
We have
got lots of,
Commissioner Johnson has a question.
Yes, and I'm sorry, Kathleen, I forgot to ask how our results, both actual and revised, are compared to the national results, the national trends that we're seeing, as well as do we collect data on similar urban municipalities and just to see how we're doing overall relative to what we're seeing across the nation and in similar types of cities, not just size, but types of cities, I suppose, in terms of percentages and things of that nature.
Well, it's early going for me to really get data nationally. I know that the National League of Cities puts out a great status report. It doesn't come out until the fall, I think.
Okay.
But we do have meetings with other public finance directors in the region, and we share information on what we're estimating, what we're seeing. And just anecdotally, I can tell you that all the finance directors in the region are really just blown over by the performance of the sales tax over the last few months, which really has been significant, and the growth in online sales. So
For Wyandotte County specific,
no, all over
overall.
other, Lenexa and Overland Park, all of them have said that they're really, it's really surprising.
Okay.
But we can put together some information for
But
you.
once it's available, I'm sure you all will.
Okay.
Commissioner McKiernan?
Thank you, Mayor. So as Commissioner Johnson had requested with the earlier multicolor graph that looks like this, I'd love to see the 2020 numbers as well.
Okay.
And should we assume that we spent 100% of these revenues collected?
For
These
21,
funds? For these funds all years? I mean, we're showing revenue. Did we spend 100% of what we collected?
oh, well, so, in subsequent meetings, we're going to show you the fund position of each of these. So that will include the expenditure part.
So in an upcoming meeting, we'll get expenditures by year to match
Yeah.
this revenue by year.
Yeah, and then the fund balance, yeah.
Thank you.
But that kind of takes us back to the question that Commissioner Walters was pointing to, that we did not draw as many reserve funds as we had anticipated,
Right,
but we still were down 1/2 million?
yes.
Okay, from the reserve funds.
And that's an estimate.
Okay, gotcha.
All right. So the
One other
next press.
point, I think that
Yes, go
Commissioner
ahead.
Burrow's question, was there not necessary when we expended the funds, the Recovery Act, we had to provide an accounting, it was audit by the state government first, correct? Because that's where the funds came from. And then ultimately, the Treasury Department also had to sign off on what, and maybe Commissioner Bynum and Commissioner Markley can remind me.
No, we got the money from the state. The feds gave it to the state and they gave it to us. And they reviewed the expenditures to see whether they met the guidelines, and then they approved them,
I see, okay,
But the actual audit would take place in the coming 3 months by our external auditors.
I see,
There may be a chance that the state will come back and audit us later on, but
okay.
Mayor, we have I don't know that they'll talk about it tonight or we can ask, but the comprehensive audit goes through, but then they are currently doing a single audit on just our expense of the care stuff. That won't come back to us probably till the end of the year.